Hello, everyone. So our director of programming, we've had a few regional meetings and, we have like 100 people in the room and nobody can get anybody's attention because we don't have microphones at that point. And she's awesome because she'll go, I'm not going to yell in the microphone, clap once if you can hear me. And everybody claps. It's amazing. But with the microphone, we don't have to do that tonight. So who got to get out today and enjoy this beautiful day in one of your Metroparks? Yes. Did anybody happen to go down to the other end of Glass City here and see all of the people enjoying the Mini Mommy and all the playgrounds? Oh, I just love it. Okay, on to the scripted stuff. Good evening. On behalf of Metroparks Toledo, welcome to the Glass City Metropark for the next installment of Metroparks Sustaining Our World Speaker Series, brought to you in partnership with the Metroparks Foundation and Dana Incorporated. My name is Lisa Witten. I am the operations manager for the Central Region, but tonight my role is to welcome you all, share some thanks, and share a bit about the work of the Green Team. Has anybody heard of the Green Team yet? Oh, somebody there. Tonight's event is part of the third season. Can you believe it's been 3 seasons? It's just crazy and amazing. All of them have been amazing. In our Sustaining Our World Speaker Series, which is free and open to the public, and focused on topics of significance related to environmental sustainability, the importance of protecting and restoring our ecosystems, and ways that each of us can make a difference in our future. By bringing a wide range of topics and speakers, our hope is to inspire thoughtful dialogue and action. That's the most important part, isn't it? The action part. To protect the future of our natural world. We also want to share various ways that we as individuals can make a difference. So speaking of ways that we can make a difference as individuals, everyone that you see walking around the Metroparks that has our lovely logo wear or a uniform, you know that each and every one of them cares deeply about the environment and conservation, right? Everybody that works at the Metroparks does, yes. So 2 years ago, the Green Team was developed for staff that wanted to do even more to make Metroparks operations as sustainable as possible. So we do have members of the Green Team here tonight, if you want to raise your hands. They're here to help you guys. If you have any questions during the program tonight, you'll just write those in the journal. If you need a journal, they can get you one now. At the end of the presentation, you'll pass those questions up and we can ask those. So if anybody needs a journal, just raise your hand. Our Green Team members will get those for you. I would like to highlight a few of the initiatives that the Green Team has led. If you've noticed the bottle and can recycling bins throughout the parks, how many have seen bogs out on our bins? This was managed by the Green Team and made possible by a grant from the Ohio EPA. If you've used the 3 food waste drop-off locations, has anybody used those? Yes, they're awesome. If you haven't, do it. It is so easy. You just have a 5-gallon bucket at your house, you fill it with your food waste, and you bring it either literally across the parking lot over there, 901 Front Street, or Swan Creek Airport parking lot, or TBG Bancroft lot. You can compost so much of your food waste, and that was one of the Green Team's initiatives made possible by the City of Toledo. If you go to the marina, you'll see sea bins, which I just noticed today that actually, if you got one of our 2023 flyers here, you can see our sea bins are in there, as well as our bogs recycle bins. So those were all Green Team initiatives that we were able to complete in the last few years. Thank you again to Dana for their support in making this series possible. Dana and Metroparks share in a vision to create a more sustainable world. In 2023, Dana was named as one of America's climate leaders by USA Today, and the company has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2040. Please join me with applause to thank Dana for the support. In addition to their support of this series, we are grateful to have Dana as one of our lead donors for the Glass City Riverwalk project. Phase 2 of the Glass City Metropark opened in June 2023 and has welcomed over 450,000 visitors. to enjoy unique playgrounds, thousands of new trees. They're starting to grow, they're trying. It's not good dirt down there, so they have a little ways to go. Trails and special experiences. Construction now continues on the next phase of the Riverwalk, which includes the work outside Imagination Station and across the river at International Park. When completed, the project will bring 300 acres of new green space and a 5-mile Riverwalk to our downtown waterfront. Thank you, Dana. Your leadership and commitment to these efforts makes a difference. Now, before we transition, I would also like to thank Metroparks Foundation and our Metroparks members. I'm sure most of you in the room actually are members. Support from donors like Dana and our Metroparks members make programs like this one possible. Membership support helps send hundreds of kids to free summer camp each year. My office is in one of our camp locations, and just today as I was leaving my office, I got to see Madison, who is one of the leaders for our camps, just singing along with this group of kids, and they were just singing at the top of their lungs after her. It was amazing. So hundreds of kids get to go to summer camp for free each year, helps us complete important restoration initiatives, and provides new play structures and so much more. Many of you here are already Metroparks members, but if you aren't a member, it's simple to join and make a difference. Brochures at the table, or speak to one of our staff members about how you can join us. And every member receives a free t-shirt every year. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Tim Sheeter from the Metroparks Department of Natural Resources. During his long tenure at Metroparks, Tim has worked closely with tonight's speaker on various research projects, authoring numerous papers documenting the impact of restoration initiatives across Northwest Ohio. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm totally thrilled here to introduce Dr. Scott Abella to you all. Scott is a great friend of mine. He's been a great friend of Metroparks, and he's the most accomplished scientist that I know. So Scott has a Bachelor of Science degree in Natural Resources Management from Grand Valley State University, a Master of Science in Forest Resources with an Experimental Statistics minor from Clemson University, a PhD in Forest Science with a Restoration Ecology emphasis from Northern Arizona University. He is the founder of Natural Resource Conservation LLC, which is dedicated to providing knowledge services in natural resources management and ecological restoration. On top of that, he is also associate professor in restoration ecology with the School of Life Sciences at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he teaches classes in forest ecology, restoration ecology, dryland ecology, soils ecology, and plant ecology. On top of all that, he is the editor-in-chief of the journal Ecological Restoration. He is the author of one book on conservation in U.S. national parks, and he is the author of 150 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, including 20 that are specifically focused on research within the Metroparks. And it's that role that I really got to know Scott well over the last 20 years or so. And his research, which he's going to be highlighting today, has really helped to drive some of the restoration work that we've done across the park system. We are practitioners in what is called adaptive resource management, and this requires a constant feedback of information that we can use to make better decisions. And the state of the parks today would not be the same without the critical information that we've gotten from Scott and his research over the years. So with that, I'll stop talking and I'll be thrilled to turn it over to Scott for the rest of the day.
I'm really excited to be here today, and it is unusual. Actually, a lot of times talking about openings or Northwestern stuff. Today, I'll be talking on Nevada, around Las Vegas, Nevada. And people have asked me, I grew up in the area, so that's been my connection. So I'm coming back here just about every summer since 2015, as Tim mentioned, to work with Metroparks. So today I'm going to present several examples of ecological restoration and conservation projects from national parks and protected areas out west. I just want to mention a couple things. My main research focus areas has been conservation ecology and restoration ecology. And while certainly there are major environmental problems, we'll talk about some today, I tend to have a much more positive outlook, maybe in part because ecological restoration, which is the repair of ecosystems that have been damaged or outright destroyed, tends to be an optimistic field, right? There's a positive outlook to that because if we're not able to actually do restoration, enhance habitat, improve quality of habitats that have been degraded, there wouldn't be the field of ecological restoration, right? But we have thousands of examples of successful restoration projects at this point worldwide, some of which I've been very fortunate to be part of. And so I'm going to show you some of those today, as well as some positive examples from conservation ecology too, where we've actually been having an improvement in resource conditions in some of the protected areas we've been studying. Again, that's not universal, but there actually are a lot of positive things going on we'll talk about today. I just want to mention too that there's an image of our research building there on the right-hand side. That's where our laboratory and our offices are on the University of Nevada, Las Vegas campus. And even though I've been in Las Vegas since 2006, I still haven't gotten used to the idea of doing high-end science in our laboratory. And literally you look out the window and you see the Luxor and MGM and the Strip. You might be able to see, it's hard to, there's a glare here on the screen for me, but you might be able to see like right back, I think here is where the Strip is from the back of our building here. So literally it's only about a mile away. But as I'll mention today, it's a great location to have access to national parks that we're able to work in. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So I've set up the talk to be flexible today, depending on what you're most interested in and how much time we have. The first part of the talk is two climate-related projects that we've been working on, climate as well as interaction with some land use changes in protected areas, and really seeking to understand what are the long-term changes occurring in these natural areas. And then the second part of the talk is on wildfire, a major environmental issue out west in both the forests and the deserts. And then throughout, I'll try to infuse some applications for ecological restoration and then finish with several examples from desert habitat restoration as well. So this is Las Vegas right here. And one of the reasons that I really like being in Las Vegas is it actually has access to more national park lands than any other major metro area in the lower 48 states. In fact, over a quarter of the total lower 48 states national park land is within a 3-hour drive of Las Vegas. I mean, we have right here is Joshua Tree, about 3 hours away, Mojave National Preserve, the biggest national park in the lower 48 states, Death Valley. New in here, Tule Springs Monument in North Vegas. It's got mastodon fossils and so forth, really neat, just out in the desert. And then the first project I'll show you today is in Lake Mead National Recreation Area, about 1 million acres that connects to Grand Canyon National Park. So we have a couple million acres of national park land. And so I just want to provide a little bit of context here in terms of long-term climate in the last couple thousand years, because this will be relevant to several aspects of the talk today. And so just want to draw your attention to the medieval warm period that went from about the year 800 to about 1400. And this was a 600-year period of very hot and dry conditions. In fact, there were multi-century droughts during this period. Imagine if we entered something like that today out west. And then shortly after the medieval warm period ended, we entered the Little Ice Age that lasted from about the year 1400 to about the late 1800s. And this was a global event. There were crop failures in Europe, cold temperatures here in North America. And we then ended the Little Ice Age and entered our current climate today. And I just want to point this out because several of the changes are interacting with this long-term climate pattern. And then some of the really old trees that I'll talk about, what amazes me is we have trees that are several thousand years old and have actually passed through these majorly different climatic periods, which is pretty significant. So going forward in the upcoming decades, there's projections that the West will continue becoming warmer and drier. And for a lot of these projections, it's really important to keep in mind that they're region specific. You know, there's different things going on here in Ohio, which no time to talk about today, but we definitely have to incorporate into our work here in Northwestern Ohio. But out west, there's been a trend for the climate to become warmer and drier, and that is projected to continue. And so then the question is then, how might species be changing and how might they change in response to this warming and drying? And there's a couple quite simplistic projections that species will move north geographically or they'll move upward in elevation to track climate. You know, so there's cooler and moister conditions in northern areas and then in higher elevation areas. And then that's led to a major recommendation for a conservation strategy of assisted migration. And this is actually having humans physically move species to those locations that are projected to be suitable in the future. As you might imagine, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of controversy with that, right? For example, what if we have species that are tied to particular soil types, which we know is very common? And are those soil types going to be in northern areas, right? Maybe the climate is suitable to the north, but they don't have the soil types that they need. The other thing that this assumes is that species are not going to be able to move on their own. It also assumes that there's very little persistence ability of species in place or adaptive ability, right? And so before we embark on something like this, in fact, maybe we don't want to, right? We really need to know what are the long-term trends, what are species actually doing in nature? And much of our data is short-term. You know, we have a couple years worth of studies and so forth, but many of these changes that we're really interested in span multiple decades, particularly when we're dealing with trees, or in this case here, long-lived desert plants. And, you know, we need to know, like, what are the long-term trends for these species? And so we had a unique opportunity to do this. When I first got to University of Nevada, Las Vegas, I was interested in these types of opportunities, and I was rummaging around the UNLV library, and I came across this thesis with the title, you know, Vegetation Change, Newberry Mountains. Thank you, I appreciate that. And, you know, got really interested. I was leafing through this thesis. You know, I pull it off the shelf here. There's dust flying off. You know, it hasn't been checked out in decades, right? Nobody's looked at it. And there were really interesting maps on sampling locations. When I refer to plots or transects throughout the talk, those are basically just areas that have been delineated on the ground to sample the plants and animals present. And there were summary data, the averages of where species were and so forth were presented. And I was like, wow, you know, if we're able to actually remeasure these sampling locations, this would be truly amazing. But, you know, this was 1982 thesis, work done in the 1970s. And so, you know, I was wondering, is this Jim Holland, you know, is he still around, right? And so the study occurred in Lake Mead National Recreation Area Park Service Unit. So I drove to the park offices and thinking nobody's going to know Jim, and this is decades ago. I was like, hey, anybody, you know this Jim Holland? And they're like, yeah, he's about 30 feet from you right now. So it turns out that he had graduated from UNLV and was the park planner then for Lake Mead Rec Area and had stayed locally. And so I went down and introduced myself, and Jim was thrilled that people were interested in his work. And then I'm thinking there's no way that he still has like detailed plot locations, right? Because this is before GPS, right? This is in the 70s, okay? And so I tentatively asked, I was like, do you happen to know, do you have survey directions on how to get back to these plots? And he's like, yeah, I actually have a huge map that I can bring in. So I was like, okay, great. And then I'm thinking there's no way that he has the raw data. So then I asked, I'm like, do you have the original data? And he's like, yep, they're in a box in my garage. I'll bring them back over lunch hour. So there we go. We had the opportunity here, really unique, to do this long-term research. And so this is part of the map showing these transect locations across this mountain range. Again, it's just southeast of Las Vegas. And what was really unique about this is that we were able to have a series of Chris Roberts was a graduate student at UNLV that we were able to have remeasure, and then we were able to collaborate with Carrie Norman from the National Park Service to remeasure these then multiple times. So we ended up with about a 40-year record of change in these desert habitats of the vegetation. And what was also really unique is Jim, the original person that put these in the 70s, was willing to come out with us and help us relocate the plots and help us ensure that we were actually replicating his methods. And so this is a big challenge in doing this long-term research, right? A lot of times people are not present that originally did it. And so you're always a little curious, like, are we actually replicating this exactly to really pinpoint these changes? And in this case, we had the original person actually that was willing to help us. So just want to give you a view of what this area looks like. This is the Newberry Mountains here from a distance. They're actually huge once you get back in there. And this is, again, some views here. And then woodland at the highest elevation, pinyon juniper woodland. And then the river in the background is actually the Colorado River. So there's a big elevation gradient, huge landscape, great opportunity to see how have species actually been changing over the last 40 years? And are our simplistic projections that species are going to move north or up in elevation, has that actually been happening over the last 4 decades? So just want to show a little bit here, just some of the initial trends. Overall, so first of all, in 1979, there were 110 total perennial desert plant species that were detected. And then it jumped to 139 and then 140 4 decades later. So we actually had an overall increase in the number of native perennial plant species. By perennial, meaning they live more than 1 year. And they're almost all native. There was only 1 or 2 that were non-native. So these are indigenous species, very desirable native desert plant species. So this was a positive overall. And I want to show you a couple things here. These are some repeat photos, 1979 here from the top. And by the way, we can actually confirm these photos were from the 70s because the people in here are actually wearing bell-bottom pants, okay? So in 1979, we have this gray circle here. This was a barrel cactus, and then the same cactus was present in 2008. But then what was really interesting is all these other red circles were new barrel cactus that became established. And this was confirmed by the plot data too. So there's a pretty big increase in the barrel cactus. But I want to show you, and this is just kind of from memory here, because again, I can't see the slides too good from here. I think it's right here. If you match this up to, this would be 1979, and then 2008, do you notice how those plants, those are blackbrush shrubs, they're basically in the same exact locations, and they barely changed, okay? And so there was a lot of this, where we would have some species that would change, maybe increase or decrease, and then other species, like we were just pointing out, basically stayed exactly the same. And again, you can see that here in the photos, and then that was also confirmed using the actual plot data. And just want to mention very quickly that this increase in cactus, like the barrel cactus, was also has been a widespread phenomenon. This was also observed in Grand Canyon National Park. These are some repeat photos from Grand Canyon, 1890. And then as we go through here, again, same exact location. Okay, as we go through here, then there's a lot more barrel cactus that become visible. And again, these are actually confirmed by actual data too. We could say, well, were they just small in 1890? They were not actually present, at all. And so they've really been increasing. Back here to Lake Mead, most of the slides I have today are photos. I just want to show you a little bit of, or to give you a taste of some of the actual scientific data that we generated as part of this study. And so we can run through this here. So let's just look at this right-hand side. This is broken down by different vegetation types. Let's not worry about that. Let's just look at overall here. And it's, I'll just point this out. 1979, 2008, and 2016 right here. And if we look at this, this is the number of perennial plant species, and it's broken down by plant type. Let's not worry about that. Let's just look at the total. What do you notice here from 79, 2008 to 2016? That trend. Yeah, there's a big increase, right? So a couple slides ago, we showed that it increased from a total from 110 species to about 140. And now on each individual sampling location, there was about 100 sampling locations, we're also seeing an increase, pretty substantial, by actually about 30% on average. And then this bottom graph here, this is the cover of like how much of the ground is actually covered by native plants. And it actually doubles. It goes from 8% right here in 1979 to 16% in 2016. And remember, this is the full gradient, basically from the Colorado River, where plant cover is really sparse at that really low elevation because it only gets a couple inches of rain, all the way up to the pinyon juniper woodland at the higher elevations. And so here in the desert, getting up to 16% plant cover is actually pretty high, right? So we're showing, all of these metrics that we're measuring here have shown pretty substantial increases in native plants. So this is a positive. I then want to show you some data for how species were actually changing in terms of where they were distributed up or down elevation. And so this shows the number of the species over here, and it shows whether they decrease their distributions in terms of their maximum elevation. So where they're at the highest elevation, what happened over that 40-year period? Did they actually decrease in elevation then, or did they further increase in elevation? And so what we found is that 48% of the species did increase in elevation. Okay, so that would be consistent with the projection, right, that we're having species move up in elevation if climate becomes warmer and drier. However, we actually had 29% of species actually move down in elevation, 23% did not change. So actually more than half the species moved down in elevation or did not change. And we also saw that if we look at these other measures, like the average elevation where species were found, just taking every occurrence of the species and what was the elevation on the mountain range where they were found. There was 57% of species that moved up in elevation as predicted, but then 41% of species actually moved down in elevation, okay? So these are very interesting patterns here, right? Not exactly as expected. So in terms of the climate from the 70s through the 2000s, what actually happened? So precipitation did decrease on average by about 16%. That's pretty substantial. And we also had about a 2 degree Fahrenheit average temperature increase, okay? So again, it's getting warmer and drier as has been forecasted, right? So you might think, well, this is a desert, right? Moisture is limiting, shouldn't plants have actually decreased? But instead, we showed that they were almost all the measures were actually increasing, right? So, why might that be? So there might be two main reasons. First of all, desert plants are very susceptible to freezes. That can be catastrophic to desert plant populations, including to cacti, right? Freezing and cactus are not exactly compatible, right? Especially for desert species. And so we went from a situation where from 1914 to 1978, just before that first measurement, there were freezes in January on average every 6 years. But since that time period, there was only one freeze, and that was in 2007, okay? So there's a major alleviation of freezing to desert plants, which is a major damaging agent, right? That's being lessened. The other thing that might be going on is the cold air drainage effect, right? Maybe some of you have actually experienced that. You know, it occurs here in Ohio too, where low-lying areas a lot of times have colder temperatures locally because cold air sinks, right? Well, the same thing on a mountain range like this. And so, you know, if we're getting an overall warming effect, we might be able to have species then that actually can move down in elevation and inhabit these cold air drainages that previously were actually too cold for a lot of species to inhabit. And this raises a really important point in that when we're talking about climate changes, we have to be really specific, right? And what is the baseline from which the changes are actually occurring? And just one example, let's say that you do have a 2 degree Fahrenheit rise, which is what occurred here. What if that rise is occurring from a base temperature, say average temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and it goes from 40 to 42 degrees? That might not be a major influence in terms of the ecology, right? But what if that same 2 degree rise occurs from a baseline of 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the average temperature rises to 33 degrees Fahrenheit, right? That 2 degree difference at that point is the difference between freezing and not freezing, right? So we really need to think about these types of factors. The other major factor, you know, I mentioned some of these interactions can occur with land use change. The other major factor that could relate to why we are seeing such an improvement in habitat quality for these desert plants is that there was historical livestock grazing in the area, and including even after it became a national park unit. It took a while for it to actually get phased out. And then there were also a lot of horses and burros in the area, which are feral animals in this area that have escaped. The Park Service in the 1990s moved off the feral burros in particular. The burros were most abundant in this area. So we were not getting a high level of herbivory once these animals were moved off the landscape. And so this could be a positive feedback for potentially multiple reasons. I want to introduce the idea of a nurse plant effect. And so out in deserts, this can be really important, where we can have perennial shrubs or any perennial plant that can cast shade, can enable other plants to recruit. Because again, in deserts, sunlight is not limiting, right? What's actually limiting is having shade and moisture, okay? So if you have a shrub that's casting shade, that can actually facilitate other plants to start growing beneath it. So if we remove these grazers, remove these plants from actually being eaten, we can have the nurse plants recover themselves, and then it can become a positive feedback where, because we have these nurse plants, that can actually help facilitate other plants to recruit. And it did seem like that's what we were seeing based on some of the seedlings that we're establishing on these plots over the years, because again, it was very detailed mapping on where all these different plants were. So of course, we would need further research to really pinpoint some of these reasons, but our study was able to identify some of these long-term changes. And so this brings up, I think, several considerations. You know, first of all, when we're talking about climatic changes, we need to be really specific. What if, for example, and this is one of the scenarios for desert areas, what if you don't actually get a change in rainfall, an average rainfall per year? But what if instead of having 20 days of rain in a year, you get that full amount of rain delivered in just 10 days? Okay, so in other words, there's more rain per event. That can have a major influence, including if it's different timings, if the rainfall shifts during the year, on when plants can actually utilize that moisture. And then also items like we were talking about with the temperature changes, like from what baseline are these changes occurring? Also, I think it raises a really important point that maybe, just for consideration, one of our best adaptation strategies that we could have could be trying to get ecosystems in as good of a shape as possible so they can be most resilient to future changes. For example, removing the grazing effects off the landscape so these areas can continue to recover and have that process of nurse plant effects and facilitation. The other implication, I think, from the work here is that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't maybe try that assisted migration idea, right? Where we're moving species around. But it means maybe we really need to re-examine this a little bit more closely, right? Because the idea with assisted migration would be that we would be moving species up in elevation. But nature was doing the opposite, right? Nature was saying no over the last 40 years. Half the species were moving in a different direction, right? So maybe some of our assumptions need to be reevaluated on this. And again, maybe some great opportunities to actually do some of these tests because, we don't know if maybe the environment wasn't suitable or maybe species were just not able to disperse to these different areas. So we really need, I think, to figure a lot of this stuff out. But overall, this was a really positive example where it's definitely not doom and gloom here. I'm not saying all landscapes are going to be the same, but the changes that occurred over this 40-year period, this is one of the marquee data sets from national park lands in terms of long-term change in the entire Park Service, right? And this was an incredibly positive. All the metrics were improving pretty dramatically under the protection and the land use management that the Park Service was doing. So we thought that was a really positive feature and would like to keep monitoring this study too. I'd like to move to another kind of fun example here around Las Vegas in terms of the importance of water. So Las Vegas is known as the Springs. That was the name historically. That's what it means. And some of these areas were just incredible. I really wish I could have visited Las Vegas and seen these areas before everything got developed. This photo on the right here, this is actually near downtown Las Vegas, okay? It's near Fremont Street and the casinos. Like, this literally is what Las Vegas looked like, okay? Forest, wetlands, like pretty incredible. Like literally water just everywhere. There are artesian wells, really just amazing. And so, we've lost a lot of that wetland forest habitat, right? Which is obviously very rare for the desert. And that's going to become really important here in a second. Anybody know what this is? McCarran. That's a good answer. Any other guesses? So would you be surprised if I said that's a boat ramp? Okay. It's a boat ramp to nowhere. And I should mention this is even extended, right? So this is the Las Vegas Wash. So Las Vegas would be back over here, and then Lake Mead is actually now miles to the right here on your screen. And this was underwater. This boat ramp, if you were here in the 1990s, it would have been under like 200 feet of water, okay? And so as the lake receded, they kept extending and extending this, right? But then it gets to the point where the lake now is just miles away, right? So no way to have the boat ramp here. And so this shows some satellite imagery, just showing the contraction and the kind of the famous bathtub ring where the lake used to be. And just to give you a feel, there's been 60,000 acres of new shoreline habitat that's been exposed as the lake has been receding. And that's an area the size actually exceeding Denver, Colorado, which is a huge sprawling city if you're familiar with that. That's how much new land has been re-exposed by the receding of Lake Mead since the 1990s. And I just want to mention, a lot of people even the last couple years, like in the summers even, Lake Mead will be in the news and it's portrayed as a calamity, right? There's Lake Mead that's just disappearing and everything. And I will acknowledge from a water storage standpoint, the reservoir standpoint, it definitely is alarming. But you have to remember, I'm a land plant ecologist. And so you might see where this is going. This has absolutely been fantastic as far as I'm concerned because some of these areas are just absolutely beautiful through here. So the lake now is starting here, but now we have this wetland forest habitat. Again, we lost a lot of it in Las Vegas itself. Now we're getting some of this back along the Las Vegas Wash entering Lake Mead. Actually, let me go back. You may, it's too, I'm not able to see on here because of the glare, but you might be able to from your viewpoint. I think it's somewhere, oops. You might be able to see somewhere along here. There's actually, you might be able to see a little bit of a trail. Able to, that's actually, so this is all on the former lake bed, right? This is actually my favorite trail in all of Lake Mead National Recreation now. It's about 20 minutes from my house. I do it all the time. These areas now are just truly incredible. Here's a couple more views of how beautiful this is. This is actually some of the most beautiful landscape that I personally have seen in the West. These areas are just teeming with wildlife. There's coyotes there. The bird activity is just tremendous. And then, of course, what I really like, the native plant diversity is pretty incredible. There's even some locations that rare native plant species have recolonized the shoreline. Doesn't mean that all the areas are this great. Like there's some problems with tamarisk and some non-native trees and so forth. But there's some really incredible habitat, that's been re-exposed. And again, I'm not dismissing the concern over the water storage aspect of it, but from a habitat and ecosystem standpoint, I'm personally elated. I will admit that. And we have been studying what's actually been recolonizing the lake bed for several years, because we were really curious, like, okay, these desert soils have been underneath Lake Mead for, 70, 80 years, right? And now they're getting re-exposed. Have the soils changed in some way? Maybe that, desert plants are not able to grow as effectively on them. It turns out maybe that's not the case, but we've been able to use this even as a laboratory for some of our students at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where we've done different plantings and so forth, trying to test, like, can we even accelerate the habitat recovery in these areas? And if so, what would be some of the good plans to actually try to jumpstart the recovery? Another view here. Okay, so I'd like to transition to the next part of the talk here on wildfire. We're trying to give you your money's worth here and really cover several different topics and keep you entertained here. And in my view, wildfire is one of the most major environmental issues that we're facing, not just in the United States, but worldwide. I mean, Australia has had massive fires, Europe, Greece, and so forth. Wildfires are a huge issue, and it's very difficult to extract, from news reports and even the scientific literature at times, like what's actually natural, in terms of these fires. And by natural, we mean that have been long part of the evolutionary history of an ecosystem, for thousands and thousands of years. And just a couple basics here for context. So for us to have fire, we have to have three main things. Number one, we have to have fuel, okay? We have to have something to burn, and that's gonna become critical here as we go through some of the forest work here in a second. And then we need oxygen, right? And then we need some type of heat source or ignition to actually start fire. And so it's really interesting that fire has only been part of Earth for about 10% of Earth's history. The first recorded fire that we know about is about 400 million years ago. And that's based on radiocarbon dating of charcoal. And it's also based on inference in that we had to have several things happen, right, to actually be able to have fire. Number one, we had to have plants colonize land, right, to actually provide the fuel, right? And then we had to have sufficient oxygen, okay? And at different times in the past, during Earth's history, there's been even more oxygen than we have today, and perhaps much more fire activity. For example, when dinosaurs were roaming Earth, it's believed that fire was a tremendous process, co-occurring with dinosaurs being present. And so even though fire's not been that long in the evolutionary history of Earth, it's a major factor, today. And one of the factors that we've studied out in Arizona is the influence of fire on the germination of different plant species. And This is one of the plant species from ponderosa pine forest, a species of penstemon. We found that if you actually expose it to smoke, it actually increases the germination by a factor of about 10, from about 8 to 70% or so. And you can even do that just with the liquid smoke that you can buy from the store, up here. And so when we were doing this, and actually in Flagstaff, like we would go to the grocery stores and they started to get to know us because we would just buy them out of the liquid smoke. We'd have like 50 of these things, spending hundreds of dollars for our experiments. This is also an interesting projection, and again, not intending for you to obviously read the abstract. If you want to get the title here, you can access this paper if you like. I'm just putting it up here for illustration, and that they did a modeling exercise, and their conclusion was that the 2020 wildfire season alone in California negated all of the emission control efforts for CO2 since 2003. 20 years worth of attempted emission control efforts were negated just by the 2020 wildfire season. And, I remember I was here in Ohio at that time in the summer of 2020, and I remember just, looking up, and you see up in the jet stream, and some of you, if you were here, you might remember, it was all this kind of white ash up in the jet stream going very fast, okay, but, moving from California across, right? That is all carbon and particulate matter and so forth that's now been, put up into the atmosphere, right? And that doesn't even include the lost carbon storage and carbon sequestration over the ensuing decades, right? Because that's what trees do and forests do, right? But they're burned off, right? So they're not doing that. So, for people interested in climate change mitigation, perhaps managing wildfires could be a major step to contribute to that, right? And so we're going to talk about some of those issues here in a moment. I want to mention here a little bit of the history of wildfire in the United States. There's a mercurial history of wildfire here. And the map on the top right shows the distribution of major wildfires. There were some in Michigan, Wisconsin in the late 1800s, and then the Great Idaho Fire burned millions of acres in 1910. And part of why this was occurring is that logging was in full swing, industrial logging at that time, Michigan and so forth. I mean, here's a shot in the bottom right there of Saginaw Bay, all the logs, okay? And so there was a lot of logging being done, and the slash, which is the branches and the unused parts of trees, was basically left and distributed across the forest floor. Also, a lot of the small trees, were not removed. And precisely because then you didn't have the tree canopy, it became very dried out, right? It's getting exposed to direct sunlight. You have all this fuel present. And then, of course, like the photo on the top left shows, there was a lot of railroad logging done, right? So there's a lot of sparks. So we have all these ingredients here, plenty of oxygen, right? We've got a lot of fuel on the ground, and now we're having our ignition. So there were major wildfires. And the 1910 wildfire season really changed the sort of the course of history in terms of how the United States interacted with wildfire. Because at that time, fire suppression became the major strategy, the major U.S. government policy that fire is bad, it's destructive, and you can understand why people felt that way at the time, right? I mean, these wildfires, like in Wisconsin, Michigan, they were burning through entire towns, right? But as we see this map on the left with the orange signifying wildfires, this is the distribution of wildfires in the U.S. from 1984 to 2012. We're starting to not become as successful with this fire suppression campaign. And so we know a lot about the history of fire in western ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests that are referred to as historically frequent fire forests. And we know a lot about the fire history in these areas because there's a lot of fire scars that we can sample on live trees. This is a fire scar on a ponderosa pine just outside of Vegas. And so what would happen is a fire would go along here, create a small wound in the tree. The tree would then heal it over, like it's showing here on the sides. And then as there were subsequent fires, the wound would get enlarged, the tree would heal it over and get larger and so forth. And so what we can do is we can take small samples of this fire scar and then date when the fires occurred based on the tree rings. And so this is, you might be able to see the black here on the edge. This is basically from something like in here, okay? And this is from the Black Hills, and each one of these marks here shows when a fire occurred. And so just this one tree over several hundred years recorded about 10 fires during its lifetime that the tree survived, okay? And so the forest itself, right, it didn't mean that this tree would always get burned, right? The forest itself, as a whole, maybe was getting fires every 2 to 3 years, okay, if we include many different trees to actually record that. But again, enter Smokey Bear, and all fires are bad. Smokey Bear, by the way, is probably one of the most effective media campaigns, and I think Smokey Bear is really cool, but maybe the wildfire that, that all fires are bad maybe wasn't the best strategy as we're seeing, because basically what we went from was a situation shown here in this cartoon where we would have frequent surface fires. That's meaning they're just burning lightly along the ground, kind of burning the underbrush, thinning out the forest. We would occasionally have opportunities for some trees to become established, but not very many, right? Because they're getting thinned out by these frequent fires. So we had almost a savanna-like, very open forest. Well, if we think about a forest being burned every 2 to 3 years, naturally for thousands of years, and then the last 100 years, there's been no fire, that forest maybe has, quote, missed 30 to 50 fires, right? I mean, that is a major impact to a forest that's used to having that type of frequent fire, right? So, now, as the bottom image shows, now we've had so much fuel accumulating, because remember, this is out west, right? So it's a semi-arid climate. Stuff doesn't decompose fast like it does here in Ohio. So the fuel just keeps accumulating, and then you get more and more trees. And so now when there is an ignition, even if it's a lightning ignition, we can have major, very severe wildfires that pretty much can take out the forest. Just some examples here also. It's also loss of habitat. Okay, this is images from Yosemite National Park, California, 1866. Notice these meadows, okay? Open meadows, very open forest here. And then notice how by 1961, the forest is already very dense and the meadows are gone, right? And all that really important habitat is gone. This is from Sequoia National Park, 1890 to 1970. And then notice all of the ladder fuel here, right? Where now small trees have become established, so if these small trees catch fire, fire can then reach the canopies of these thousands of years old sequoia and also redwood trees as well, okay? And then this image, the set of images on the right-hand side is from northern Arizona, very open forest in 1909. And then notice all those small saplings of ponderosa pine by the 1940s. And again, imagine if fires had continued to go through here to thin out the forest. We wouldn't, be seeing this situation, right? And then by the 1990s, notice how it's just super dense forest. So severe fire danger, but we've also lost the flowering plants in the understory for elk and other wildlife too. And I want to mention here a really important point, that the type of fire and the type of forest matters. We've been talking about ponderosa pine forests that naturally had a frequent fire regime, very different than an ecosystem like at Yellowstone National Park, okay? In Yellowstone National Park, the so-called stand replacing fires, or the severe fires, it's called stand replacing because literally it kills all the existing trees and then enables the next forest to regrow. In a place like Yellowstone, that type of fire is what we would consider to be natural. And there's several indicators for that. In addition to the fire history that was reconstructed, lodgepole pine, a dominant tree in Yellowstone, has pine cones that are triggered to open by heat. Okay, and then it disperses seeds. And then there's literally seedlings that will establish, in some cases they were establishing literally like weeks after the famous 1988 Yellowstone fires. And then we're starting to get forest regrowing, showing on the top right image. So there's not Many forests like this out west, most of the forests are actually the frequent fire variety. And so this is where there's a lot of confusion about what is natural, what is not natural, right? So in this ecosystem, in a place like Yellowstone, these severe fires periodically, every couple hundred years, would be natural. But in the vast majority of our western forests with ponderosa pine and other mixed conifer tree species, it would be instead more of a frequent fire, surface fire, not killing the trees. And the fires that we're getting now that are severe and taking out the forest would really be inconsistent with the long-term evolutionary environment. And another, kind of supporting detail on that, this is back in the ponderosa pine forest. Do you notice how the lower branches have self-pruned here? Okay. Do you notice how it's really high up on the tree that you actually get branches, okay? And ponderosa pine has many of these types of adaptations that we can interpret to be consistent with frequent surface fire, right? Because by having its branches high, if there's fires burning along the forest floor, the flames are not actually going to reach the lower branches to then be able to get up in the canopy and kill the pines. Not intending for you to read this, just wanted to show this as an example, in that what's very interesting to me about this story is that there were many scientists in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, like this is a 1943 publication, that were warning about this, okay? That, hey, fire is actually an ecological process, it's natural in these forests, and that suppressing these fires is going to cause a problem down the road. And they were showing the picture on the right-hand side of these trees and ladder fuels already starting to become established. And I find this so fascinating because these scientists were basically just bulldozed, right? I mean, it's Smokey Bear, fire is bad, right? But I oftentimes think about, how our situation might be different if we had been able to actually maybe listen to some of these folks and have either lightning fires allowed to burn in the 40s, 50s, 60s, or even prescribed fires, and we might not be in the type of situation that we're in today. I want to show just a couple examples locally in Las Vegas here of forest change, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly so I can get to some of the other components of the talk here. We've done this work in the National Forest just outside of Las Vegas. And, so the lower left photo, I think, is pretty significant because this is only about 45 minutes outside of Las Vegas, and I've actually been up in the forested area up there getting snowed on, like in June, and then you look down and Vegas itself is like simmering in heat waves, okay? Pretty amazing. There's a ski area up here. I mean, it goes up to 12,000 feet, and so it's literally about a 2-mile rise. Vegas is about 2,000 feet in elevation. This gets up to about 12,000. So it's a really unique area that we really want to protect. Just a couple images here. This is, again, just right outside of Las Vegas in the forest. These classic fire scars indicative of frequent surface fire over centuries. And then they're, again, same story. The fires have been suppressed. So there hasn't been fire in the last 100 years. And then how we do this in terms of the reconstruction to determine what forests were in the past, we look for dead wood. So these are stumps that were cut in the 1920s, actually. Again, that's an advantage that we have out west with stuff not decomposing as fast. So we can get old logging records and reconstruct what was there. We can then also age some of the old trees by taking small cores, and then we can reconstruct, how many trees were actually here at different time periods, like in the 1800s, when there were still frequent surface fires. Just want to show a couple examples here. In this image up top, literally if we were here in the 1800s, we'd have this tree, there's a couple others, and now we just have this wall of young trees. These are all less than about 90 years old that have come in. We also have this starting to happen, okay? This is white fir, a species that's not tolerant of fire, as you might imagine, because of the structure here. You can envision it might be getting burned up if we had frequent fires going through, and it's starting to become established below this overstory of ponderosa pine. And to me, this is a really interesting situation because white fir, not tolerant of fire, has been able to actually move downslope, okay, without fire, but it's more of a higher elevation moist site species. So if we're getting warmer and drier, I'm very curious about whether white fir can actually survive at these sites over long term. And that's a concern because the ponderosa pine are not regenerating because there's not frequent surface fires for them, and now there's competition from these smaller trees. So this is something that we'll probably want to watch more closely. Then there has been severe wildfire, unfortunately, on this forested landscape as well, which again is a major loss because there's not much forest around Las Vegas. So this is a before and after the 2013 Carpenter fire on one of our research plots. And I want to mention that some of these trees here we've aged. Some of these trees actually established in the 1300s, okay? So 700 some years old, right? Hundreds of years before the US even became established. And so, you know, a question is like, has there been an event that, you know, major stand replacing fire? Well, certainly not in the last 700 years, right? Because these trees are 700 years old. And so what's really sad is it went from this to this after the fire. So 100% mortality, severe fire. So here's some of the trees, you know, that were lost, some of the old trees in the data set. And then here's, again, some of the landscape, right? So, you know, major loss here. Didn't have time to show some of the videos here, but one of the other major issues is on these slopes with the vegetation being burned off, the erosion has been tremendous. And that's what's actually shown on the bottom right image. I mean, that's hundreds, maybe thousands of years of soil formation, right? That's getting washed down out of the mountain. The next question then is, okay, well, you know, might ponderosa pine recover? How fast might it recover? Unfortunately, you know, it's not lodgepole pine up in Yellowstone, right? So like after these types of really unnatural types of fires, we're seeing really slow recovery where where ponderosa pine seeds don't disperse very far because they've really never needed to, right? There's not been in their evolutionary history a wildfire that's like 50 miles long, right? So the recovery on these is expected to be really, really long. So this is an opportunity where, you know, doing some of the forest restoration, soil stabilization, trying to rejuvenate soils so we can get some of these forests back could be really important. In addition to, you know, wanting to have our landscape be more resilient. We don't want it like on the top right. We can't maintain this, right? Smokey Bears had, you know, about an 80-year run or so, right? But we're just not able to maintain, you know, as these fuels have continued to accumulate, coupled with, you know, warmer and drier today, we're just not able to maintain these forests. So we really need back to really what we had, the more open forests that are also great wildlife habitat as well in terms of the understory plants for pollinators and so forth too. So one of the proactive solutions that we can have is actually doing forest thinning, ecologically based forest thinning, as well as reinstituting prescribed fires or letting lightning ignitions or other wildfires burn in a managed way. And so I just wanted to show this image here from northern Arizona. The right image shows the before and after restoration. Again, same exact location, the arrows are pointing to the same trees. And notice how after restoration, the bottom photo, there's been a reduction in fuels, right? So we've reduced the fire danger, so we'll be able to actually maintain these old growth trees, right? Instead of having them get burned up. And then also on the bottom, notice how there's been a great response to the understory plants, you know, the native grasses and so forth. Again, we need food for wildlife and cover for wildlife too. So, you know, this is ironic, and, you know, we have this too in Metroparks Toledo here, where a lot of times to actually conserve forests, we actually have to cut trees, okay? So that's kind of ironic, But, in this case, we have to be reducing fuels so that we're actually able to have these forests be able to number one, protect the old trees, and number two, be able to withstand frequent surface fires if there's a lightning ignition and so forth, and not have us actually lose the entire forest because of the changes that have occurred over the last 100 years or so. I want to discuss a little bit now fire in the deserts, because fire in the deserts is also a major issue, but for a different reason. So unlike the ponderosa pine forests, deserts such as around Las Vegas, Mojave Desert, are not thought to have had much, if any, fire historically, because, as you might expect, they're so fuel limited, right? There's very little to no evidence that there was much, if any, fire with some exceptions, in most of these desert ecosystems. However, what we've had in the last several decades is invasion by non-native plants. These are not indigenous to the area. One of the major ones is red brome. And on the right photo, that's that thatch, okay? That's an annual grass, so it only grows 1 year and then dies. And it has a much different growth form than the native plants. Again, it kind of grows as like a thatch like this that then can stay for several years. And the issue with this is, instead of having these big open spaces, this is creosote shrubs here. Now we have, number one, a large amount of fuel, and number two, a large continuity of fuel, right? So if we do get an ignition, these kind of grasslands now can burn continuously, and fire can move from one shrub to the next. So we've gone from a situation where there's not a history of fire in deserts to now we have the fuel conditions where we're having some pretty substantial wildfires. This is Red Rock Canyon National Recreation Area, visited by about 1 million people a year, iconic area. Vegas is just in the back here. But notice this is before fire, and then this is after fire. And this is a small fire, okay? But oops. Notice the difference in habitat here, right? I mean, major loss here in terms of wildlife habitat. And we'll talk about in a moment how persistent this actually is and how long these areas might take to recover. So we've been doing this actually for the second decade now, where we've been studying wildfires that have occurred back to 1980, and we're trying to figure out how long these wildfires around Las Vegas are actually taking to recover to some semblance of what was there originally, or that are present in the unburned areas. And so we have a whole series of study sites all around Las Vegas on these different wildfires. And I want to mention, sometimes you have adventures in fieldwork. I mean, I've had all kinds of stuff happen. I've been shot at multiple times as I've been sampling vegetation. There's a lot of strange stuff that can happen. This was one of those days where we were sampling one of our fire recovery plots, and this coyote kind of showed up. And at first you're like, ooh, is this like a rabid animal? Wasn't that, just was very kind of curious, but very wary, and was like, what are you doing here in my habitat? And was kind of mildly disinterested, but just kind of watching what we were doing. And then when the sampling tapes came out, okay, to delineate our sampling plot, you might be able to see some of the sampling tapes here. That really kind of piqued the coyote's interest here. And I'm not sure what it was about the sampling tapes, but coyote kind of got more daring, checking it out here, okay, really exploring. And again, we're right here sampling the plot, okay? And then we ended up with this. The coyote was not helpful to our sampling. So I'm not sure what it was about those tapes, but basically we just had to kind of finish up what we were doing. And then the coyote was super friendly. In fact, it followed us for about 2 miles on the walk out. I thought I was going to have a new pet to take home, but But anyway, back to our story here. This is one of the wildfires. And again, we've tried to kind of provide a balanced viewpoint for you today on some of the ecological conditions. We've shown some positive things. This is not positive, okay? This is denuded. Pretty much everything here on this burned area, like all this beige stuff, that's that non-native grass. And so it benefits from fire and kind of surges after fire, and then the native species do not, okay? Some of the old fires were still very distinctively different. So this was a 1988 wildfire. This is the area that burned here in front, and this is the unburned, and it's still like a dividing line, okay, with how different this vegetation still is. And so, one question is, okay, well, like how long might these areas take to recover? And it varies depending on the vegetation type, but some of the projections are that to get the actual species back based on the recovery rates that we've observed, these are actual data that we've observed over 40 years, or burns that were over 40 years old, it's projected to be about 550 years. Okay, for recovery. And you might say, well, that's ridiculously long. Well, there's several reasons why it's potentially that first of all, that's what we're actually observing, right? When we're actually measuring, and there's literally like 1%, if that, recovery per year. Okay, so again, part of it's just a math problem. But part of it's an ecological problem too, in that one of the major species, one of the major species here in the unburned area is blackbrush. It's that grayish shrub again. And it has huge seeds, and they're dispersed by small mammals. And one of the major dispersers is a species of kangaroo rat, okay, which does a great job of dispersing the seeds, however, not in burned areas, because the kangaroo rat likes shrubland habitat. Like this area out here that's burned, kangaroo rats avoid that actively, okay? So we have an issue here where we have a large seeded species, right? It doesn't blow in the wind or anything of that nature, and its major seed disperser does not want to go out into these open burn areas. That's just not its habitat. And some of these burn areas can be 10, 20 miles long, right? So it's not unrealistic to expect that literally it could be that long if we don't actually do active restoration to recover some of these areas. We also need to think about the implications for habitat in terms of wildlife. And one of the thrilling animal species that I really enjoy seeing out in the desert is the endangered desert tortoise. And it is an endangered species, but you can actually see it fairly regularly if you're out in the desert. And to me, it's just thrilling to see this tortoise that can be 50 some years old just kind of motoring through the desert. Never looking particularly happy, by the way. They always seem pretty grumpy if you encounter them, but they're really neat to see. But they need big shrubs, for example, to create burrows beneath. This is a tortoise that's resting. Large shrubs are critical for them for the protection, okay? And so one of the issues is that we might get some plants to recover on these burned areas, but they're different plants than are in the mature shrublands. And so one example is the photo on the right. That small shrub in the foreground here, that snakeweed, that's one of the major colonizers of these burned areas, and it can persist for decades. But notice that that's not even big enough to hold a tortoise, right? So not all plant species are created equal, in terms of what they can actually provide different wildlife species. So this is a major concern. It's a recovery debt situation potentially where, the plants that we're getting in are not as high quality in terms of what habitat they would provide. So, this again is where, first of all, prevention, developing treatments for these non-native grasses, but also restoration actions to maybe accelerate the recovery on these burned areas. And so I just want to go through some of these examples very quickly here to then conclude the talk of some of the desert habitat restoration techniques that we've been working on and trying to develop. one of the major challenges is not just low rainfall, but also herbivory, or animals actually eating the plants, because first of all, there's not much green plants oftentimes in the deserts for animals to eat, but also if you've been growing these plants in the greenhouse, right, they're enriched in nutrients, and so then you put these plants out on the landscape, and it seems like every jackrabbit and every animal comes for miles to just consume our plants. So there's, on the right-hand photo, there's a creosote bush that's in a shelter to both protect the creosote in terms of the moisture, but also protect it from animals eating it, at least until it can get established. This here is dry water. This is a slow-release irrigation gel that you can actually put in the soil next to a plant, and then the plant roots can slowly extract that moisture. The gel will break down into actual water. And this is a great strategy for particularly remote sites that you might not be able to actually go and water on a regular basis. The right-hand photo, also the bottom right, shows protecting a puncha or beaver tail cactus using rock shelters. We've actually been able to double survival of cactus plantings just using on-site rocks as a creative solution. Seed pelleting, you might be able to see some whitish dots. These are actually seeds inside that are enclosed in a coating, and they don't work for all species, but for this species of desert plantain here, it's a native wildflower that's great forage for desert tortoises. And we've seen amazing success if you can actually pelletize the seeds and enclose them in a protective coating, then they're able to evade seed predators, and they're able to germinate much better in the infrequent rains that may occur. We're also doing a lot of work with abiotic or non-living structures. This is in Joshua Tree National Park, and we're using vertical mulch here, where basically you're planting dead plant material, like you're planting branches to try and simulate a native plant. And of course, it's not going to be doing all the functions of a native plant, but what we're trying to do is provide some shade. We're trying to trap seeds, trying to catch organic matter, so that we can actually then get some plants to germinate, and we're not having to rely on having good rainfall right after our plantings. I mean, that's a huge risk. I mean, imagine if you're the Park Service and you spend $100,000 to grow a bunch of native plants, you plant them, all you can really do then is hope that there's a good rainfall year, right? The year that you plant. Using this strategy, it's more of a bet hedging approach, right? Because you're putting these structures out in the landscape, and they can just be there for then whenever there actually is a good rainfall year, right? So then you have this vertical mulch present, there's a good rainfall year that occurs, seed maybe that's trapped there can then germinate. So this can also be a more low-cost method as well. This is another example. This is actually a grass. This is not a live plant, actually. This is dead pieces of the grass planted to simulate a live plant. And what was really significant about this is that these vertical mulch and the little micro-catchment structures I was showing you did a great job of slowing down soil erosion. And that's really important because in Vegas we get windstorms a lot, and major potential health effects. In fact, there's alerts, to not go outside, on certain days because of the dust exposure. And either way, in addition to the human health concerns, losing all of that soil from sites is not good, right? In terms of the productivity, given how long it takes deserts to form soils. And so in this project, we had all 144 live plants that we planted die, which was super frustrating, but it was the driest year in the last 47 years that we did the planting. But then, as I mentioned, because we did hedge our bets, this is Vegas after all, right? So we hedged our bets, and we had the non-living structures. They actually did do what they were supposed to by slowing soil erosion, and then we were getting some live shrub seedlings appear near the abiotic structures. So I think particularly since we may be getting warmer and drier, and there's maybe less years that's conducive to planting. This is maybe a good potential strategy. This is a project that we just literally finished implementing a couple weeks ago. This is to decommission an old road in a protected area just outside of Las Vegas. We had an amazing crew. They're digging water catchments here to try to trap water. The idea being there's not going to be much water there, right? So what we're just trying to do is concentrate water in particular locations to have it reach levels high enough for native plants to be able to germinate, okay? Because, naturally deserts don't have continuous plant cover, right? We just want particular areas, to be able to get these native shrubs to start recreating that structure. Here's some vertical mulch going in. And then we also gathered litter, basically the leaves and debris and so forth from below creosotes. And then we're getting some donor material from nearby, and then we're actually spreading it to actually introduce seeds to these structures that we're creating. Again, we're trying different stuff, to see what might work, and we're also trying low-cost techniques here. And then here's just a picture of the crew here. So we're going to be monitoring this for the next several years, and we'll see what happens, because we need to be adaptable. As we're getting more drought conditions, we still have all of these areas that need to be restored. And, it's not acceptable, right? Just to be like, well, it's drought, conditions are difficult, we can't do anything. This is maybe when we need to do things the most, right? Because we want to be limiting that dust generation and soil erosion and so forth. So these are some of the things that we're testing out. With that, I want to stop here, and really enjoyed it today. See if you have any questions. Thank you. Okay, great. Yeah. Yes. I kind of, in some ways, live a double life, actually, because we still have stuff going on back in Nevada and a bunch of western states, actually. So I was even just talking to one of our research staff that's up at the north rim of the Grand Canyon today doing a project there. So we do a bunch of stuff out west, but I have been, as Tim mentioned in the intro, I have been coming back every summer since 2015 to work here with the Metroparks, which again, I really enjoy. I mean, I grew up here in the Toledo area. So we're trying to help Metroparks with a wide variety of activities with fire management and oak openings, the monitoring system that Metroparks has started to monitor habitat quality throughout the park district. So those are some of the projects that we're working on here. Yeah.
So when we heard about the wildfires out west, I hear a lot of times it's climate change that is causing it. However, after your talk now, I'm thinking maybe the smoke there campaign had a lot to do with it. Feeling it was either or both.
So that's really interesting. So on maybe the introductory slide was one of the first slides. There was the California Fire Science Consortium insignia that we're affiliated with. And that's one of our most major tasks that we need to do, is to try to, highlight that, certainly climate in terms of extending fire seasons now and reducing soil moisture, maybe even changes in winds and so forth, that can be a contributing factor. But, as we were showing with that fire triangle, even the underlying really cause of these major wildfires is the fuel, the change in the fuel. Because, without fuel, we don't have fire, right? And it's major change in the fuel. So, yeah.
So you also mentioned that there's been wildfire problems in a lot of different continents. So did the other places also have like a smoky bear campaign?
So that's very interesting. So there have been some of that fire suppression. There's also been different land use changes, like some places in Europe for literally millennia have had burning, for example, to clear different fields or keep forests open for grazing animals. And then in the last several decades, those land uses, a lot of those land uses have been abandoned. And so what they're then seeing, again, places like Greece, other places, the forest has been growing just like what we see out, out west. And so they've had, very similar issues. But for comparison, some of the Arizona researchers we've collaborated with, some of the forests in Mexico that are very similar to the Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico ponderosa pine forest have actually had continuing fire regimes where if we had a lightning strike in Mexico, it would just be allowed to burn. And the forests are very different there. They're much more open. There's not the fuel issues, that we're seeing in the United States. And again, this really comes down to a matter of really trying to understand what's the long-term history of these ecosystems and sort of what are they attuned, to being like. So yeah, very good question. Yeah.
Has heavy rain experienced in the last 12 months in the west affected the soil moisture?
For the soil moisture in the last 12 months or so, you're saying? Yeah, I mean, from 2020 to about 2022, there was a really, as you may be aware, there's about a 3-year drought, when we got very little rainfall. And 2023 was a decent rainfall year. So far in 2024, this spring, in terms of the wildflower season, was unusual because we got a ton of rain, actually, but really cold temperatures. So we had a really abbreviated spring where stuff germinated pretty late, and we had about a month of kind of optimal growing conditions. And then, of course, by April, it was already starting to get into the 90s, 100 degrees. So I just didn't have time to kind of show everything here, but we do have some plots out in the desert near weather stations, kind of all throughout southern Nevada, where we've been tracking the annual plants for the last 10 years and tying it to exact rainfall amounts recorded at the weather stations. And so we're really hoping to start seeing, are there those types of patterns? We're about ready to do that because now we actually have enough data for that to be a long-term trend to see in what years and can we predict in advance what type of wildflower seasons we might get, which is good, but then that's also the years that these non-native grasses would be growing too, which would be then the fire risk years also. So it's been a little better this year, but maybe still recovering from that 3-year drought from 2020 to 2022. Good question. Yeah.
What about the seed bank? In the forest, more foresty areas or in more brush areas, when a fire comes through, does it destroy the depth of the seed bank and eventually would things just naturally start to come back?
Good question. So if you couldn't hear in the back, the question is how does fire maybe influence the soil seed bank? And so that's seeds that are stored in the soil. And that's a really good question. And again, might come down to the type of fire. Those frequent low severity fires, we've actually collected the soil samples from around Arizona and in the Las Vegas area from these forests. And if you do expose them to smoke and heat, then you can actually increase the germination of some of the plants. However, to your point, if you're getting a really severe kind of those unnatural fires, that's where it can literally be incinerating the actual seeds where they're not able to be protected enough in the soil in terms of insulating from heat. And then, of course, if we're getting the soil erosion too, it really is a multiple whammy, right? Because we're losing the adult trees, so they're not present to produce seed. And then we're also losing the soil seed bank, so then we're totally reliant almost on just seeds dispersing in. And then as we also talked about, the other issue then is if some of the fires are 20, 30 miles across, part of the issue is we're just not able to get seed, to these areas. So very good question. Yeah.
What were your ignition sources on that slide? You talked about lightning, and what were some of the other ignition sources?
Good question. So lightning is definitely one. There can also be lava as an ignition source, even potentially rocks falling and creating sparks. is another one that maybe isn't overly common, but certainly can happen, given the right conditions. And then, of course, humans, as well. Yep. Yeah, Denise.
See in any of your data sets differences because of indigenous people settling in certain areas?
Really good question. So we have not been able to tie it to that other than just trying to get as much of the oral history of areas as possible. Like, for example, in the forested area I was showing from around Las Vegas, that is traditional lands of the Paiutes. So there have been a couple papers where some investigators have tried to learn what they can about whether humans were igniting fires historically. And certainly, around here, it was really driven, in much of the eastern North America, was driven by, human ignitions, of course. Out west, it appears that humans maybe were augmenting the ignition. So, a lot of lightning, enough lightning. But, in certain areas, like California, maybe could have had more of a human influence. A lot of these higher elevation forests were more kind of just summer camp areas. And so maybe a little bit less of the human influence, but it could be more of like an augmentation of the lightning ignitions. That's a really good point.
I'm just wondering also, like in other countries, like in India or Morocco, and the Sahara and the Berber people are the equivalent of the native people that live here on the
Yes.
and their land use, and where they live, there's, higher biodiversity.
Yes, and these are really good questions, that kind of transcend, the science and then the ethical, kind of what are our value systems, because, we do have so many ecosystems that have developed under human influences since the last major ice age, the one 10,000 years ago ending, right? And that's long enough for species to, have an evolutionary response, So for us, if we have this human influence system like fire, and we have all of this rich biodiversity that's developed, as a result of that, typically for us in conservation and restoration, right, we want to value that, and maintain those species because it's an evolutionary time period, that long, so.
The data really didn't show that they were extended areas.
Right, yeah, we did not differentiate lightning from human ignitions. There's one of the potential ways to do that is to look at fire seasonality. And if humans were perhaps burning at a different time period than would be typical of when the major lightning or the lightning ignited fires would be occurring, that's one of the ways that it can potentially be partitioned. But it is difficult to actually, partition that, but yep. Thank you. Thank you, appreciate it. I'll be careful of this cup. It's empty now, so.
Yes. Thank you again, Scott. That was an excellent presentation. I want to thank Dana again, as well as the Metroparks Foundation and all of our members here. I want to give a little preview. Everyone, mark your calendars for the fall. What's amazing about these presentations is we get to learn about things from far away, all the way in Las Vegas, deserts. We don't have those here. That's awesome. But in the fall, we're also going to get to learn about things that we can do locally. And so October 22nd, I want you to mark your calendars for that. We have Nature's Best Chance, native plant landscapes. Gardening with native plants is not just a passing fad, so please make sure you come on the 22nd and learn all about how we will have John and Susan Cross here to teach us all about native landscaping and things that you can do in your own backyard. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a good evening.